Within the last year or two, Gary Vee started an NFT collection called VeeFriends. It may have been even more recently or later than the last year, but I believe it was within the last year or two. And VeeFriends, my understanding at least, is that VeeFriends is a collection of mascots that are designed to promote different positive traits or attributes. And my understanding as well is that the attributes relate to things that Gary Vee has promoted, such as patience or that sort of thing. I don't know if that's an exact example, but it's along those lines. And the reason I think VeeFriends is interesting, it's not because it's related to Gary Vee, even though evidently it is. The reason I think VeeFriends is intriguing is because VeeFriends demonstrates that Gary Vee understands NFTs better than most people, or many people. The reason I say that is many people view NFTs as a way to make a bunch of money. And evidently there are people that have been able to make a bunch of money from NFTs, which is great. Granted, you have to pay, potentially pay taxes and stuff like that, which I think people don't always think about when they sell stuff, such as meme stocks. They don't think about if you sell something in the short term, you're going to have to pay short-term gains, which can catch up really fast. But the reason I think VeeFriends is so interesting is it shows that Gary Vee understands that NFTs, at least in my opinion, are really just an IP play. When I say IP, I mean intellectual property. For example, my understanding is an example would be, let's say Disney owns Buzz Lightyear. Buzz Lightyear, if I'm not mistaken, is an example of IP. And then if you have that name or image or likeness or so forth, you can then license it out to different companies and make a bunch of money and so forth, or even use it in different sectors. So, for example, my understanding is Gary Vee, if he hasn't already, could take the VeeFriend IP and use it to sell stuffed animals, which I think is something he's talked about, or you could put it on backpacks or lunch boxes, if people use lunch boxes or what have you, which is really smart, as opposed to just, oh, I'm going to make $1 bajillion potentially off this and people are going to buy my NFTs and that sort of thing. I mean, if people do buy NFTs, great, and you make money, great, but he understands the longer term game, and I'm not just saying this because he talks about patience, which evidently he does talk about patience a lot. I'm saying this because, in my opinion, a lot of people don't understand that NFTs are IP play. They just look at it as a way to quickly make some money. So that's the reason. That's one of the reasons I mentioned VeeFriends. I also like the designs. I think the designs are super cool. As someone that's a huge fan of mascots, but beyond just the mascot designs, which I think are awesome, the fact that they're promoting positivity, which I think is awesome. The reason I mentioned VeeFriends is because it demonstrates that Gary Vee actually understands that NFTs, at least in my opinion, are about IP, not necessarily about making a quick buck. There were rumors when Tillman Fertitta, who happens to also be an entrepreneur, bought the Houston Rockets for, it was a few $1 billion or so. And if I'm not mistaken, at the time it was a record. At the time, he was talking about wanting to bring professional hockey to Houston. I don't know if he's still planning on doing it, but I'm mentioning it because I think it's interesting, partially because Texas has obviously continued to, or has benefited tremendously from the pandemic in terms of population growth. And I think it's also partially interesting because I know that, and some people have complained about this, but hockey has at times entered markets that wouldn't necessarily traditionally be considered traditional hockey markets, instead of being in places like Canada, where you would consider hockey to be more common or popular, such as Arizona. Arizona is an example of one of these markets. But the main reason, so that's interesting, but the main reason I think it's interesting is my understanding is that Houston is one of the more, if not the most diverse places in the U.S. in terms of people from different cultures. And so, to the point where I think some people would even consider it a global city, in the same regard that maybe you'd view New York or LA or Miami, or, in terms of the US, obviously there are examples outside the US, such as London, as another example outside the U.S. of like these like, or maybe even France, in terms of like these, global cities or people all over the world are familiar with it or travel to it or so forth, or at least they have historically. But the reason I think it's interesting is if the NHL were to go to Houston, if they were able to, let's say, be uber successful, it would be interesting to see how much it would or wouldn't help the sport grow. Or it would be interesting to see if it would help the sport grow globally. I know hockey is popular in some other parts of the world outside of the U.S., such as, Canada is obviously an example, and there are other parts. Like I think it's also popular in Europe, but it'd be really interesting to see if expanding into Houston would help the sport grow globally or not. I think it would, in addition to the fact that it could potentially be popular in Houston. Maybe it wouldn't, I don't know, but obviously I know that there's a team in Dallas and then there's some other teams nearby. That's the reason I mentioned the Houston thing, is I think it's interesting. Or it would be interesting to see if it would help, because even though hockey is popular, it feels very niche, at least from the outside looking in. And I think it could really make a difference if they were to go into Houston, which I think is which is why I think it would be super interesting. I also think it's interesting from like a finance perspective. It would be interesting from a finance perspective to see how much they'd have to pay in an expansion fee. So I think that could be interesting as well. Or how much they would have to pay in an expansion fee. Another topic, in addition to sports and finance, that I'm going to cover, especially going forward on this podcast, is mental health. And one of the things that I found helpful, even though it's something I'm still working on and I've been trying to work on for a long time, is mindfulness. In other words, being present. And it's not always easy or even at times fun, especially in today's world where we have so many distractions, which is something I've referenced in the past in previous podcasts. And it can be very, very, very difficult not to try to multitask. And it feels like in some ways being present's more difficult than ever. With all today's technology, another aspect of it is I have ADD, diagnosed ADD, and I'm not always the best at focusing, especially if I'm more tired. I definitely have trouble focusing on things for long periods of time. I also wonder how much of it has to do with the fact that, like, even if you look at music, like, it seems like today's music's like 4 minutes long, where historically some classic rock, it felt like it was like 6 minutes, 7 minutes long. Like some of those songs, it felt like it feels like last forever in terms of how long they are. So it almost feels like we're being trained, or maybe not trained, but it almost feels like humans have evolved to the point where our attention span's not as strong or as long lasting as it was for previous generations, because there's so much content and so forth that's shorter. Which, I mean, in some ways I guess it's more efficient, which is cool, but it's also not necessarily a good thing depending on how you look at it in terms of content and being a certain length and in terms of attention span. And so one way to combat that, if you can, is be mindful. For example, meditation, journaling. Another example could be, if and or when you can, not looking at your phone. Like if you're waiting for something, instead of like checking your phone, like, oh, I gotta look at my phone, I gotta see what's going on online, I gotta check social media, I gotta, and so forth. You just sit still, and even if it means that for a few seconds here and there you're bored, you just wait. So like if you're waiting to talk to someone, like outside of like if you're gonna meet with someone, you're waiting to meet with someone, you just sit and wait instead of checking your phone. Or if you're waiting for a ride somewhere, you just sit and wait instead of looking at your electronic device. And it's definitely not fun and or easy, but I think that it can be very helpful in terms of not only being more present, but it can also, because you're experiencing less stimulation, and for some people, if they experience less stimulation, it can reduce anxiety. I mean, I've experienced that. Like, when I don't use technology as much, and I'm not saying I'm amazing at this, because I'm not very good at it overall at all. I do like to read, but I definitely enjoy continuously learning via technology. But if you're able to avoid that stimulation, at least in my experience, it has helped reduce my anxiety, which I think is interesting. And I also wonder in some cases, and this is proven, and that doesn't mean I'm good at it, because I'm not, but if you don't look at screens before bed, it's easier to fall asleep, and I'm guessing it's because, and I don't think we necessarily think about this, and maybe humans are adapting to it regardless, when you're intaking all this information, whether it's like Netflix, YouTube, what have you, Twitter, what have you, your brain's thinking about it nonstop. So if you don't take the time to think about it, I wonder how much of what's going on is that all this information is continuously building up inside your mind. In other words, you're consistently intaking information, but you're not really processing it because you're continuously intaking it, which is obviously not very mindful. But I wonder how much of it builds up in your mind, and I wonder how much of it is your mind's consistently trying to process everything you're just intaking. You, your mind's trying to process everything you just intook, if that's the proper verbiage. And that I wonder how much of that, not only does it prevent you from being mindful, but I wonder how much of that